Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to have all of you here today. And on the behalf of the Institute of Economics, our teachers, staff, undergraduate and graduate students, I would like to thank warmly our dear friend, Professor Randall Wray, and also Professor Shi Hao, and Ellison also. It's really very nice to us to receive you, Professor Randall, again, at the Institute of Economics. Professor Wray, as you know, is one of the most influential students of Minsky. He's one of the most prominent researchers in the field of monetary economics and has a very persuasive theory that provides a substantial critique to orthodox theory, as well a very large room for the development of an alternative approach in terms of theory and in terms of policies. This year, Professor Randall, we are commemorating in the Institute of Economics our 50th anniversary. In these last 50 years, Brazil and also our institute lived a big chance, big transformations and big challenges also. The difficult and more harsh years of the dictatorship, then a period of the movement for democratization. The formation of the new republic, the plans of stabilization, some very heterodox plans here, the Constitution of 1988, named the Citizen Constitution, and a lot of different kinds of policies in areas like science and tech and technology, employment, social policies, food security, monetary policies, and so on. And now this unbelievable interlude of social, economic, and political regression. I have no doubts that we need an urgent reorientation of our profession. Our community here continue on its path to the good tradition of political economy. We insist together in our commitment to history, in the quest for investigating the process of development of contemporary capitalism, and also the peculiarities of our own process of development here. We insist in our overture to the interdisciplinarity and in our pluralistic but very engaged point of view. In this context, I firmly believe that your presence here, Professor, and the inauguration today of your graduate course named Modern Money Theory, it will be of the most great significance for our students and teachers. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. First of all, on behalf of the graduate program of the Institute of Economics, I'd like to thank Professor Randall Wray that kindly accepted our invitation to come to Campinas for a couple of lectures, being this the first one. So again, Professor Wray, and now officially speaking, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for our institution to host you and your family here. I also would like to thank to the whole community of the Institute of Economics for all the help. I mean, we have a fantastic group of people working here at the graduate office, at the director's office, and basically in our whole department. Their very competent and committed work make our dreams come true, so thank you for all this. I also would like to thank my colleagues at the faculty that also helped to turn this project into reality. and my special thanks to our director, Paul Facalazza, and then for all your help. And last but not least, to all people attending this session today, the graduate students that I think are very happy and very anxious for the course, the undergraduate students, my colleagues, professors, researchers, thank you all for being here. So before handing over to our guest, I will do a brief presentation of Professor Randall Wray. Randall Wray is now Professor of Economics at Barter College. His current research focuses on a critique of orthodox monetary theory and policy and the development of an alternative approach. He also publishes and researches in the areas of full employment policy and fiscal policy as well. He's also working to publish and republish the work of Minsky. So his last book is called Why Minsky Matters, an Introduction to the Work of a Maverick Economist. It's a 2016 book. He also wrote Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies, Understanding Modern Money, The Rise and Fall of Money, Matter and Capitalism, among many other books. So I'm not going to detail here all the publications and researches and activities performed by Professor Wray, because that would take hours. So I finally give the floor to Professor Randall Wray to start his first lecture. Thank you.
All right, thank you for coming out, and thank you for the invitation. I need to reposition. Yes. The box. So what I wanted to do is give a very broad general introduction to modern money theory. I know that some of you will be here over the next 2 weeks to get a lot more details, but other people, this may be the only exposure you get, so I wanted to make sure that I cover the main points in a very general way. And so that is what I will try to do over the next hour. First, let me just say that when we set out about 25 years ago with this research agenda, we were not thinking that we were starting a new school of thought. That was never a plan. We saw what we were doing as fitting in to heterodox economics, and in particular within post-Keynesian economics. Bill Mitchell, Warren Mosler, and I, and then many other people along the way, we saw what we were doing as just part of post-Keynesian economics. And we thought it would be a very easy task to convince our fellow heterodox economists of the ideas that we were promulgating. Turned out we were wrong. The reaction against what we were saying was very strong, and actually maybe strongest among post-Keynesians. And so we actually were pushed out. It wasn't that we singled ourselves out as doing something different. We were pushed out and said, no, that's not post-Keynesian. Okay? Well, after 25 years, I think we have proven that we're just in part of the heterodox economics, and we really weren't saying anything new. In great respects, we are recovering ideas that had been lost, or maybe just minimized, maybe not completely lost. And now I think that much of what we started saying 25 years ago is accepted as being within the heterodox tradition, and that's the way we always saw it. We didn't really come up with the term modern money theory. Bill Mitchell believes that it was a commentator on his blog, Billy blog, who named it. called it modern money theory. We weren't calling it that. Now, it's true, I used the term modern money in the very first book, Understanding Modern Money. It wasn't declaring a new school of thought, it was actually an inside joke. Because Keynes, as some of you will know, in the treatise, talking about George Frederick Knapp, had said that, I think that what he says is true and has been true for the past 4,000 years at least. And so Knapp's approach to money applied to all the monetary systems for the past 4,000 years. Before that, we don't know. Okay, and so as a joke, I titled the book Understanding Modern Money. It only applies to the past 4,000 years, the modern period. We don't know previous to that. Okay, that's where the words came from. It wasn't to declare a new school of thought. So let me just say how it is situated within the heterodox approaches to money. There are similarities or differences among the schools of thought. So Marx, Keynes, Veblen, Minsky all had a very similar monetary theory of production. MCM prime in Marx, theory of business enterprise in Veblen, but they're all getting at the same thing, which is that capitalism is different from other systems. It's a system in which money dominates. Okay? Institutionalists, following Veblen, and I include Minsky as an institutionalist. He concluded himself as an institutionalist. His early training was in institutional economics, not in Keynesian economics. Money is all bound up with power. And it's the power to do good and also the power to do bad. Okay? It's the most important institution of a capitalist economy. That's a key word. Money is an institution. Money is not a thing, it's an institution. Post-Keynesians, I know that most of you here are familiar with Davidson's work. Money is all about uncertainty, and we use monetary contracts to reduce the uncertainty of what we have to deliver in the future and all that. So it's all about money and contracts and uncertainty. Holding money quells the disquietude, as Keynes put it. And then also the endogenous money, which goes back to the very early 70s in post-Keynesian thought with Basil Moore. He wrote a book in 1988. I wrote my first book in 1990, Endogenous Money. So that's the other thing that comes out of the post-Keynesian stream of thought. Okay, chartists. Knapp and Innes are the two early chartists that we get a lot of ideas from, and Goodhart, and also you can find it in Minsky, and that is the role of the state. Our money is a state money, virtually without exception. The monies are always state monies. And it's all bound up with sovereignty. Now, there are other aspects to sovereignty. Money isn't the only one, but money is a very important aspect of sovereignty. And I'll come back to that. That was what we were emphasizing 25 years ago. We were trying to bring that back. It's in Keynes, it's very clear in the treatise on money that Keynes adopts Knapp's approach, state money approach. Okay? Functional finance, which was basically in the air after World War II. It is in Abelard, it's in Minsky, it's also in Milton Friedman, it's in Beardsley Rommel, who I'll quote in a few minutes. It was everywhere, but it gradually was lost over the 60s and 70s to the point where it was really forgotten. Matt Forstetter helped me bring that back. He was working with us on what became modern money theory. And this has to do with the state, money, and the government spending. And then sectoral balances. I'm attributing this to Godley, of course. Those of you who know sectoral balances probably got it through Godley, but it's also in Minsky. In Minsky, it's a little bit under the covers, but if you look at it, his 1963 American Economic Review paper, very clear. And he knew Ritter. And Ritter was the first one who tried to do the balance sheets. So anyway, all those things together are now modern money theory. They've all been incorporated within what we were doing. So it's not that there's anything new in modern money theory. There may be one thing that's new. It's a pretty minor thing. But for the most part, it's just an integration of all these things. That's what it is. It's an integration in a way that it hadn't been done before. So now let me begin. That's an introduction to the introduction. Now I'll do the introduction to modern money theory. So I presume everyone in this room heard this story about money. My older daughter, not this one, came home from first grade and told me this story. She had just learned it in school in first grade. I said, well, that's not quite right. She said, yes, it is, Daddy. This is what the teacher taught us. So they learned it at 6 years old. And even if you never went to school, you would have learned this. Because it's the conventional view of where money came from. So we have Robinson Crusoe, and we have Friday. You notice the subservient relationship there. And they want to trade grain. Crusoe knows how to grow grain for fish. Friday knows how to fish. And it's very inconvenient. So at first they use barter, but because it's so inconvenient, they decide to use a medium of exchange. So maybe in the beginning it's seashells, but there's supposed to be a natural evolutionary process until they settle on precious metal. Okay, why precious metals? Because it has physical characteristics that make it a very good medium of exchange. Gold is the best one. It's known as the noble metal because its form never changes. It never rusts, it never spoils. It's also extremely valuable, so you don't have to have very much of it in order to engage in exchange. There is one problem with gold. It's very valuable in very small quantities. So theft is always a problem. And so you have goldsmiths who already know how to store gold because they have the same problem. So they offer to hold your gold for you in a safe. And they will issue receipts against the gold. They figure out they can issue more receipts than they have gold. So we get the deposit expansion process in the money multiplier notion directly. Because they know that all those receipts won't come back on the same day. So they can actually issue more notes than they have gold, and they can use the gold for other purposes, making jewelry and so on. At the same time, people with receipts find out they actually don't need to go get the gold. They can use the receipts directly as a medium of exchange because everyone knows you can go to the purpose of gold. So we have the creation of notes that are backed by gold. The goldsmiths become the first bankers because they learn that they can issue these notes that will function as a medium of exchange. And they can make loans using these notes. So they get deposits of gold, they expand it through the money multiplier, and they can issue the medium of exchange. So then you knew all that before you went to school. Okay, then in school you learn about how modern banks are supposed to operate. The central bank controls the money supply. We no longer have gold, but we have required reserve ratios. So the central bank can control the quantity of reserves, and then through the reserve requirement, we can calculate the size of the money multiplier, and that will determine how much money the private banks can expand the money supply by. So central banks target reserves, control the money supply in order to mostly control inflation. That is how it was always taught in money and banking classes. Over the past 20 years, the mainstream has come to realize that actually central banks cannot control reserves, and that reserves don't control the money supply. So they have switched to interest rate targets and developed a different theory to replace the old monetarist story. But it is still about central bank controlling the monetary system by controlling the interest rate. What is money? Well, from the barter story, what we are highlighting is that money is created to lubricate the market. It's to eliminate the necessity of a double coincidence of loss. So money is all about a medium of exchange. And so the typical approach is you identify money by those things that best satisfy the medium of exchange function. Okay? So you say that, well, cash, obviously, that can be used as a medium of exchange. Demand deposits also are a close substitute. We want to include those. And then we can argue about whether we want to include savings deposits and certificates of deposit and so on as part of our money supply, according to how easy it is to use those as media of exchange. So the point is, you're defining money by a function and identifying the things that fulfill that function. They admit that there are other functions of money, but they're derived from the medium of exchange function. So that's the dominant one. You can also use money as a means of payment, that is paying down your own debts, and you can also use money as a store of value. People will remember what Keynes said about that in general theory. No one outside an insane asylum would hold money as a store of value in a neoclassical world, because there's no uncertainty and there's no return of money. Okay, but in any event, store of value is also supposed to be an approach. So that is the way that they approach money. In your first Principles of Economics course, you got this diagram. Okay? So now we're moving from the money world to the goods and services and production world. And so there's a circular flow. The firms hire factors of production and pay wages and other factor payments to households. Households use that money to buy the goods and services that the firms are selling. Okay? And so the money goes around this circular flow. When I first saw this, I said, well, where does the money come from? And I was at a conference, well, actually a workshop, with 2 Nobel Prize winners. And I was arguing the endogenous money story, and they said, no. They say, firms pay wages to households, and households use those wages to buy the output. The money comes from the firms. You say, okay, but where did firms get it? Well, from the households. Where did the households get it? Well, from the firms. Okay. There was no story of how the money got into this circular flow, and they couldn't understand that this is an infinite regress argument. I'm serious, they could not understand that. They couldn't comprehend that there's a problem in this story. Now, when you take your principles class, maybe this is in chapter 5. In chapter 10, you finally have banks. Okay? And that sort of seems to resolve the problem, but if you look at the circular flow diagram carefully, it doesn't resolve it at all. Where do the banks get the money? From the savers who deposit money in the banks. Then they lend it out. Okay? They have to get the deposits first before they can lend them out. Well, where did the savers get their deposits? Well, from the firms paying wages. Where did the firms get the money? Well, from the banks who lent the deposits they got from the savers. It's still an infinite regress argument. There's no story of where money comes from in these circular flow or in the textbook. So anyway, what's wrong with the story? First, there's no evidence anywhere in the world, throughout history, barter-based markets. Okay, we've been saying this for a long time. David Graeber's very famous book makes the same argument. Going back 5,000 years, there's absolutely no evidence of any markets based on barter. Didn't happen. In fact, money exists before markets. Money existed in Babylonia before there were any markets. How do we know? They wrote it down. Okay? There were price lists. There was money. The very first records of writing were actually money, keeping track. And I'll come back to the more plausible argument. Even the Austrians who developed this notion of the evolution from barter through gold up to the modern monetary system, admit, George Selgin is one of the best known Austrians who promote this view. They admit that if you have more than 10 people and about 10 different commodities, it's very unlikely that an evolutionary market process is going to settle on one of those commodities to serve as a medium of exchange. It just becomes too complex. So they use computers to solve it. Okay, well, primitive people didn't have computers. So the notion that an invisible hand could have settled on one commodity to serve as the medium of exchange just doesn't seem plausible. And then finally, from the historical record, such as it exists, the authorities were always there. Money does not seem to have come out of private exchanges. It seems to be an invention of the authorities. There also is a problem with the transition from a commodity money to a fiat money. Okay, so this is also admitted by Austrians. Why would you accept a piece of paper? Maybe we can understand why you would accept gold in paper, but why would you accept a piece of paper that is not convertible to gold? Okay, the whole barter-based story was based on a commodity. Well, we have to rely on I trust Billy Bob and Buffy Sue, and I've also heard a very prominent post-Keynesian try to make this argument. Why does he accept otherwise a worthless piece of paper? He said, well, I trust that somebody else will accept it. Well, this is another infinite regress argument. Okay, I'll accept it if everyone else accepts it. But how can we get this started so that people will accept otherwise worthless pieces of paper? So we need an alternative explanation. So I'll talk about the MMT alternative. Origins and nature of money, the role of the state, the role of taxes, sovereign currencies, and then we can address the relation between the currency and the government. There is a problem. We will never know where money came from. We're never going to find the written record where somebody said, you know, this morning I invented money and this is how I did it. We're not going to find that. The reason is because money pre-existed writing. The first evidence of writing was keeping track of debts and credits in money terms. So money already existed. Writing wasn't invented by poets. It was invented by accountants. Okay? So when we go back through time and archaeologists dig stuff up, what we find is something like this. I don't know if you can see it from your seat, but it has obvious scratch marks in it made by humans. This is 50,000 years ago. What were they doing? We don't know. They're keeping track of something. Okay? I mean, that's a guess. But it seems they're keeping track of something. This is, I believe, 30,000 years ago. These are bones, and maybe harder to see, but these also have hash marks, but they're more complicated and a lot more of them. They're keeping track of something. What is it? We don't know. Okay? We move forward in time. Babylonia, about 5,000 years ago. These are clay balls that have holes so that tokens can be stuffed into them. What are they? Well, actually, we know something about these. Because these tokens are what they later used to make the cuneiform tablets. They would press these into the tablets instead of stuffing them into a ball. And we can read them. Okay? So we know that the tokens represented particular things like goats, horses, and so on. And those then were pressed into tablets, to keep track of credits and debits. So we can read these, and we know that all of these had to do, well, not all, most of these had to do with record keeping of money values. So that's what they were for. Okay? And then finally, I suppose all of you know what these are, tally sticks. Okay, tally sticks were Hazelwood sticks that are split down the middle, so you get a stock and a stub. They have hash marks. They look an awful lot like the hash marks in the bones. They go across them. Here are some right here. They're split into stock and stub. In English, I don't know if you have the same term. In Portuguese, we have the term raise a tally. When the king wants horses and wagons to conduct a war, he has to raise a tally in order to get the supplies that he needs. What does that mean? It means that the exchequer of the treasury goes out, they cut down trees, they make a bunch of tally sticks, they split them into stock and stub so that they can purchase the wagons and horses using the tally sticks and keep the stock to match the stub and stock later. Now, why would anyone give up a wagon to get half of a stick? Because they could use those to pay taxes. Okay, and that was the reason why there was a stock and stub, so that on tax day, the exchequer and the treasury in Britain, they used a red and white checkered tablecloth, spread it on the ground, and all the villagers would come in and pay their taxes. The exchequer would check the stock and stub and make sure they matched perfectly so that nobody had carved a few extra hash marks in to reduce their taxes, right? Make the stick more valuable. Make sure there had been no counterfeiting, and then the taxes were paid. What did the king do when he got the tally sticks back? It's tax revenue, right? When the king receives the tax revenue, he burns all the sticks. All the revenue is always burned. Tax revenue is to be burned, not spent. The king spent the tally sticks to get the wagons. When he receives the tax revenue, he burns it. So keep that in mind. All right, so these are different technologies for recording money, debits, and credits. They're just different technologies using different ways to record the debits and credits. There's a guy named Philip Grierson, who was a professor of currency, coins, in Cambridge, who was trying to think of an alternative to the barter story. Where did money come from? Based on what he knew about coins, coins were created around 700 BC. So money existed for thousands of years before coins. Okay? He's an expert on coins, and he's wondering, how did money originate in the beginning? And he made this argument. It's the best argument I know of. So it's the one that I've adopted. Do we know for sure that it's correct? No, we don't. All right, but it does fit the evidence. The barter story doesn't fit any evidence. Okay, this one fits the evidence that we have. So his story was that money did not come out of markets. It came out of the penal system. And we know a lot about tribal societies, and all the tribal societies that we've come into contact with have some sort of a system to eliminate blood feuds. In America, we have the story of Hatfield and McCoys. That's probably not going to work here because you don't know who they were. But there's two families very famous for having a blood feud that went on for centuries in America, killing members of each other's family. Okay? So tribal society, to stop blood feuds, if you injured the member of another family, the tribal council had established a list of fines that had to be paid to the damaged family. Okay, so if you accidentally killed someone, or maybe you did it on purpose, then your family had to pay fines to the other family. You were in debt. And these fines were established in the general councils. There was a specific fine that had to be paid for each specific kind of injury that you caused. And they were always payable in something useful. Okay? So it's a direct payment of a horse, a pig, or whatever. Okay? Well, that's tribal society. In civilized society, the fines are paid in money. They're not paid in cattle. And the fines are paid, we say, to society, right? You drive your car too fast, and you owe a debt to society. You always pay it to the authorities. So Gerson is wondering about how did we transition from a system in which the payments were always in kind to payments that are always in money, and instead of paying victims, you pay the authorities. So his hypothesis was that with the rise of civilization and authorities, okay, they could be monarchs or they could be democratic societies, in either case. The authorities didn't want to be paid in kind. For them, it was more convenient to be paid in money terms, in general terms, and be able to use money to buy the things they wanted. Because let's say that the speeding fine is a pig, and everybody is driving their car too fast. You end up with hundreds of thousands of pigs. Okay? It's more convenient to be paid in a money account. And they discovered that they could issue their own liabilities denominated in the money account that they choose, and then receive those back in payments. So his hypothesis was that we had this transition from the variegated fines to modern money fines. And that is where money came from. It was this attempt to find a general unit of account that could be used to measure fines, fees, tribute, and later taxes. The kinds of obligations the authorities can put on the population. Okay? So that was the hypothesis. It seems to fit what we know about early Babylonia, for example. And that's where money is hypothesized to come from. Now, unlike the barter story, where it's hard to believe that you could have a natural evolution that would single out a particular commodity that serves a medium of exchange, in this case, we have a measuring unit that's established by the authorities. Well, that fits with what we know about other measuring units. Okay, we have measuring units for volume. We have measuring units for length. In English, we use the foot. Well, where did the foot come from? The authority's foot, of course. The emperor's foot. Okay? The cubit, the inch is this distance right here. Okay? Those are all obvious. The weight units all came from grains. From baskets of grains. All weight units came, as far as we know. They always came from grains. All the early money units have names that came from the weight units. They're always a grain weight unit. And still today, some currencies, the pound, the lira, those are all weight units. And so the hypothesis is that Just like all the other units of measurement that we commonly use, they came from the authorities. You could have your own idiosyncratic weight unit, your own idiosyncratic length unit. Nobody else can use it. Okay? It has to be sanctioned by the authorities in order to have general use. So his argument is that this fits what we know about measuring units. They came from the authorities. And what were they measuring? Well, not length, not weight. They're measuring something that's much more difficult. You're measuring things that are seemingly incomparable. The money value of a sheep versus the money value of a bushel of wheat versus the money value of a fish. These are conceptually extremely difficult. It's hard to see how the higgling and haggling in a market could have come up with these things. We know that in Mesopotamia, the equivalence between the money value and the sheep, the fish, the horse, whatever, were all established by the temples. They were posted on the temple columns. They were established by the authorities. Okay, so you didn't need higgling and haggling, you didn't need markets. The authorities established what they were worth. And then that would determine how many units of the authorities' money would you receive when you deliver a sheep or a cow or a fish to the authorities. That would establish what they were worth. So it seems to fit the data better. So the alternative view, what is it? It's a state monopoly, in the sense that the state, the authorities, choose the money account. It comes from the authorities. It's a social unit of measurement, in the same way that a bushel of wheat is a social unit of measurement. It's a state money of account. Okay? It's a very general measuring unit, and potentially we can measure the value of anything in money terms, and increasingly we do. We put money values on a wider and wider range of things and activities and so on. They are money records. There's a hierarchy of IOUs denominated in the state money account. I'll come back to this. Minsky always said, anybody can create money. What he meant was, anyone can write an IOU in the money account. The problem is to get it accepted. Some are more acceptable than others. They're all denominated in the state money account. The form they take depends on technology. So whether we write it on paper, on a tally stick, on a clay tablet, is a matter of technology. What backs up our money today? I used to, when I first started teaching, I would ask American students, and they all thought it was gold. Well, it wasn't, because this was in the early 80s. We had gone off gold in the early 70s. Today, nobody believes that it's backed by gold. They know that because Ron Paul is telling them, and telling them we should back it with gold. So they've all heard that. I like to see what it says on the currency, and I have a look at your currency. In the US, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, which is a very common statement on paper monies. Canadian dollar, same thing, Australian dollar. The UK pound is interesting. There's a picture of the Queen. And the Queen says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. What does it mean? If you take £5 to the Queen, she will give you a different £5 note. Okay, that's what it means. And so hers is closer to the truth. Okay, so we call it fiat money, right? You get nothing back. Like, there's nothing there. Most of you recognize that. Green stuff. So here is the alternative that's derived from Knapp and Innes. The use of the currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on the intrinsic value. So it's not based on whether it is printed on gold or there's gold in a vault somewhere. The value of the currency is based on the power of the issuing authority. Money is just a record of a debt, and it doesn't matter what it's printed on. It's a promise to redeem, and I'll come back to what I mean by that. The state played a central role in the evolution of money. As far back as we go, we find that the authorities were involved. Goodhart wrote a paper in 98, where he put forth, Goodhart's known for Goodhart's law. Here's a second Goodhart's law. One nation, one currency rule. So when we look around the world today, and we look back as far as we can go in history, what we almost always find is each nation has its own currency. Now there have been a few exceptions in history. They were always very minor, like the Papal State used the Italian lira. Now they printed their own coins, but they were convertible directly to Italian lira. They were very small examples like that. There's one major exception to the rule, and of course that's Euroland. So this was a major exception, and Goodhart's paper really was about the problems with that Euroland would encounter because they were an exception to this rule. So why is that? Several currency. First, it's too common to be a coincidence. When the Soviet Union breaks apart, every new country chose its own currency. Is it a coincidence? Was it something they drank? No. They realized it's very important to have your own currency. Okay, it's tied up with sovereign power. Political independence, fiscal authority. So the shorthand way that we put it is we say taxes drive money. What gives money value? Taxes. Now I say it's shorthand because really it's any obligation that the authorities can put on you. Taxes have only been important since the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, fees and fines and tribute were far more important, or tithes if it was a religious authority. Taxes gradually have replaced almost everything else. We still have fines, traffic fines and so on, but they're relatively unimportant. Now it's taxes. So we say, at least today, it's taxes. The state imposes some obligations payable in the state's own money thing or money record. There's an economic historian named Farley Grubb. He's part of this little working group that I worked with at Harvard Law School. And he always says he's not a theoretician. Okay? He studies actual currency. He's probably the foremost authority on early American currency. About 2 years ago, he put out a very interesting paper that fit basically with everything we've been arguing in the working group. He studied the American colonies, so this is before they broke away from Britain. The colonies were prohibited by the British Crown from coining money. Only the British Crown could coin money. The colonies were always short money. Okay, they could not, in order to get it, they had to export to Britain. They couldn't export enough to get enough coins to function. They're busy fighting Native Americans and Canadians and later French and so on. So they needed coins to conduct business, the government's business. So they started printing money. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, there's this very peculiar thing going on in the colonies, this 1776. They just print out paper money, and even when it's not backed by gold, it's accepted, and if they don't print too much of it, it doesn't go down in value. Very strange thing. And Farnsworth investigates this, and he finds that this paper was about the Virginia colony, but it was common. They printed up paper money, and then they spent it to buy what they needed to provision the armies and so on. Every time they enacted a paper money act that would allow the colony to print, say, 10,000 Virginia pounds. They still used a pound as their measuring unit, but it was a Virginia pound, not a British pound. They also imposed a tax that was expected to raise about 10,000 pounds over a short period of time, like 3 years. So the act would specify you can print 10,000 pounds of notes, and we're going to put this tax, typically it would be a head tax or a tax on imports. And that was expected to raise 10,000 pounds. So then they would spend the notes to buy what they needed and receive them back in tax payment. And what did they do? They burned all the revenue. Just as I said about tally sticks. Tax revenue is burnt, it's not spent. The spending comes first, the taxes come later. You impose the tax liability so that people will take the otherwise worthless paper notes. The purpose of the tax is to drive the demand for the currency. It's not to collect revenue that you spend, because you don't spend your revenue, you burn it. Okay? There's no possibility of spending the revenue because you burn it. They, on the next slide, just the data, I'm not going to read all of it, but so it was about 10,000 pounds of notes that were issued. They collected 3/4 of those back in tax payments. Another quarter of the tax payments were paid in British coins, which meant that 1/4 of the paper notes remained out there in circulation. And people at the time wrote that most merchants preferred them over the coins. They found them more convenient to use the notes. So they would continue to circulate as a medium of exchange. Okay? So this was the record of the American colonies. I'll come back to redemption taxes in a minute. But here's an aside. So here's a story that is always told by the supporters of the commodity money view. There's a guy named Lerner, who, not Ava Lerner, it's a different Lerner, who wrote an article. I can't remember which of the, it's one of the top econ journals. He published this paper on the stone wheels. And Friedman writes about this too. It's an example to show that the barter story is true. So the Germans colonized the Yak Islands, and they want some roads built. So the colonial governor offers German currency to the islanders to get them to build a road. And they look at him like he's completely insane. Why would we want that? And then the Germans, of course, look at them like they're completely insane or lazy. They won't work. We're offering them money and they won't work. So some bright guy in the colonial government says, you know what? They seem to value these huge stone wheels. We don't know why, but they're valuable. Okay. And he goes around the village and he puts a big black X on something. The villagers ask, what's going on? He said, well, those are ours now. We taxed them. They belong to us. How can we get them back? Well, yeah, this road we would love for you to build. Build the road and take the black X off. Okay? Now you can see how big they are. They have to put a tree limb through and get a bunch of guys on each side to lift them and carry them around. So Lerner saw these as money. They reduced the problem of a double coincidence of wants. They had a nice medium of exchange that they could use in markets. Okay. These are more convenient than barter, supposedly. Can't put them in your pocket. You have to get a crew of people to help you move them from place to place when you buy stuff. And it turns out they have no stones like this on their island. So to get these stones, they have to paddle their little dugout canoes several hundred miles across the open ocean. They go there, they carve them, they put them on the canoe, and then they try to paddle back. But a lot of them capsize. So they end up on the bottom of the ocean. They don't care. They still count them. They know they have them. And they're on the bottom of the ocean. They can't get them, but they know where they are, more or less, within a few dozen miles. So they still count them as well. They didn't have any markets. They didn't have any money. They're just what are called primitive valuables. Okay? And there are many other examples of primitive valuables. What we call bride price. The idea that you buy wives. Okay? These are things that Westerners imposed on that society because they couldn't understand the conventions that existed in those societies. And that's all these wheels were, was primitive valuables. They were never money. They became money only when the Germans figured out that they could tax them. So it's sort of a reverse of my taxes drive money. Okay? They turned them into money by taxing them and got a sort of exchange, a road bill for it to Latin off. Okay, emission, Beardsley Rummel. I'm not going to read the long quotes, you can do it later. Beardsley Rummel was the chairman of the New York Fed, which is the most important Fed in the US. During World War II, he was also one of the New Dealers with President Roosevelt. At the end of the war, he writes this paper, and it's called Taxation for Revenue is Obsolete. He goes on to argue that we need taxes for other purposes, but the war has taught us, and the war has taught the people, that we do not need taxes for revenue purposes. Okay. Well, this is what the kings who used tally sticks understood. This is what the colonial governments understood. You need taxes for other purposes, but you don't need them for revenue purposes. You spend your currency into existence. You can tax it back, but you don't need the revenue to spend it. So he says, why do we need it? Well, one of the things we need it for is to prevent inflation. So we tax it back to get it out of the economy so that it doesn't cause inflation. So his argument was that taxes serve other purposes, but they don't need them for revenue purposes. Here's an exchange in 1941 between Eccles, who was important in the Roosevelt administration too, and Patman, who was a House of Representatives, grilling Eccles on the Fed buying government bonds. So Patman asked him, how did you get the money to buy those $2 billion of government securities? $2 billion today doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1941 it was a lot. So where is the government, the central bank, getting the money to buy all those government bonds? He says, we created it. Out of what? Out of the right to issue money. Okay, the Constitution gives to Congress the right to create money. And there's nothing behind it except the government's credit. Well, we have government bonds. Well, hold a second. So the government is creating money, which is its debt, and it is backing it up with its own debt. So that's what's running through Patman's mind. That's right, the government's own credit. So Patman asks, do you think people should pay their debts generally? And yeah, I think it depends a good deal upon the individual, but of course, if there were no debt in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. If everyone paid off all their debts, we would have no money. Suppose everyone paid their debts, would they have any money to do business on? Well, his answer is no. He didn't say no, he just went on and said, that's correct. In other words, our system is based entirely on debt. Okay, so the government's money is debt, just like the government bonds are debt. Here's Bernanke, being grilled by Congress. The Fed lent and spent $29 trillion to bail out the financial system after the global financial crisis. $29 trillion. That's 2 times GDP. Okay? So he's being grilled. This was a TV program, but he said the same thing in Congress. Is that tax money that the Fed is spending? It's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. Now, he was talking about the Fed spending and lending, but the Fed is the Treasury's bank. So what he said about Fed spending and lending also applies to the Treasury, because the Fed makes all payments for the Treasury. How do you do it? Keystrokes. Okay, that's what he said. We just use keystrokes. Let me turn to more of the history of thought. In the Treatise on Money, Keynes said the money account comes into existence along with debts. And he distinguished between money and the money account by saying money account is a description or a title, and money is the thing which answers to the description. Okay, so in the United States, we have the dollar, which is our unit account. But we also have this, most of you have seen it, green paper note. We also call it the dollar. But he's saying those are 2 different things. One is the money account, and the other is the thing that answers to the description. In Britain, their money account was always the pound, but they never printed the pound. They had no pound coins until relatively recently. So in Britain, it was very obvious that things are different. The pound is only a money account. The shilling is your coin. Okay? But unfortunately, in many countries, we use the same word for each of these 2 very different things. All right? And so I always follow Keynes and called it the money thing, but that's sort of confusing, especially as we went almost completely electronic. What is the money thing now? Well, it's a charge on a hard drive. That's what it is. Okay? You can't feel it, you can't touch it, you can't see it. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to call that a thing. It's a record. It's a money record. Further, the state claims the right to determine what thing corresponds to the name and the various declarations from time to time. So you can change the name of your currency, right? You can change the name of the money account. We changed ours from pound to dollar after the revolution. We didn't want to call it the pound anymore because we separated from Britain. So we chose the Spanish currency to be our model, not the British currency. That is, when it claims the right to re-edit the dictionary, this right is claimed by all modern states and has been so claimed for some 4,000 years at least. So this is the quote where the term modern money came from. Keynes was in the treatise using Knapp. But by far the best author on the nature of money was a guy named Introduction. Innes was the Queen's ambassador to Washington. He wrote 2 articles on money. They're the best articles ever written on money. 1913, 1914. He wrote an article on beekeeping. And he wrote a book on incarceration, which is a tremendous book. And then he wrote one other thing, which was an analysis of banking reform. As far as I know, that's all they wrote. He wrote the 1913 article and published it in a journal, the Banking Law Journal. Keynes reviewed it for the Economic Journal in 1914. Think about this. It's an obscure banking law journal, and Keynes thinks the article is important enough to review in his own journal, Economic Journal. And he said about Innes, we might quibble about some of the facts, but I think the overall argument is correct. Okay? So here's Innes' argument. If you want to read something on the nature of state money, read Innes. Knapp is extremely difficult reading and very, very long. I think the English version is 500 pages and the original is probably more like 700, I'm sure. There's some debate about whether Keynes actually read Knapp because it was in German, although Bellafiore said he absolutely read German. Other people have said he couldn't, so I don't know the truth on that. But he definitely read Innes, no doubt about it. The state enforces the dictionary. Here I'm using Keynes's terms, not Innes's, by imposing a tax liability, ensuring that the money it issues, denominated in a unit of account, is generally accepted by agreeing to accepted tax payments. So he said, the very nature of credit throughout the world is the right of the holder of the credit, the creditor, to hand back to the issuer of the debt, the debtor, the latter's acknowledgement or obligation. In other words, if you owe somebody, you can always get yourself out of debt by delivering their debt back to them. That's the very basic nature of debt. Government money is redeemable by the mechanism of taxation. So you owe the government, the way you can redeem yourself is to deliver currency back to the government, because the currency is the government's debt. It is the tax which imparts the obligation to the obligation its value. So it's because we have a tax in our government's currency that the currency has value. So this is what we say taxes drive currency. A dollar of money is a dollar not because of the material of which it is made, but because of the dollar tax which is imposed to redeem it. So a dollar is valuable not because it happens to be printed on gold, but because there's a tax system behind it. The implication, fiat money is not worthless. That green paper note that Greenspan had. It's valuable due to the state's promise to redeem it and payments to the state. Innes, Goodhart, Werner, Minsky all have this notion. Money and debt are inextricably linked. I'm not going to talk tonight about this movement, this debt-free money movement, positive money movement, is a complete misunderstanding of what money is. Money cannot be debt-free. Money is debt. It must be debt. Debts are denominated in a state money account. Minsky said that anyone can create money, deposits get accepted. All monies are created as liabilities of their issuers, and all issuers must accept their own liabilities. All money is credit money. The state money approach might seem to be inconsistent because we're saying the state has this power to force you to take its currency because it can impose a tax on you. But its currency also is a credit money. For a dollar, for the government, a dollar is a promise to satisfy, a promise to redeem, just as all other money is. So redemption means delivering an IOU in payment to its issuer. You redeem it when you deliver it back. When you paid your colonial taxes with the Virginia pounds, you were redeeming the currency back to its issuer. And they burn it. Just as you would burn your own IOUs when they're returned to you. You burn them. Whether a government's IOU is printed on paper or on gold, it is indebted just the same. Coins and paper money are both debts. Sovereignty is a set of institutions. I'm focusing on a particular institution. The sovereign has the power to impose fees, fines, and taxes, and to name what it will accept in payment. When the fees, fines, and taxes are paid, the currency is redeemed, that is accepted by the sovereign. When we go back through history, others also had the power to impose fees and fines. But as the authorities consolidate their power, they take that away from others. So in the past, we had feudal lords that issued coins too, and also imposed what we call rent on the population that they were able to control. Well, gradually over time, monarchs don't want to compete with feudal lords. In the United States, we had lumber company towns where they could do the same thing. They were sovereign in their own towns. Well, gradually over time, the sovereigns take that away from them. They want to have the control. Well, sovereigns also sometimes agree to redeem the currency for precious metal. Not much anymore. Today, it's for foreign currencies. So a sovereign might agree to redeem their currency for US dollars. That's an additional redemption that they've agreed to. It's not necessary at all. Okay? Sovereign currencies are accepted without the promise to redeem them for anything else. The basic promise is redeem it in tax payments and other obligations that are owed to the government. There are other reasons to accept the currency. Maybe I can exchange it for gold, for foreign currency, holds the sort of value. All of those things supplement taxes as driving the currency. There's a very good book by Margaret Atwood. I guess maybe some people are watching this television series based on a different book. Where she goes through the sort of the history of debt. General debt, not just money debts. I took a lot of the terminology here from her because a lot of the terms we use with regard to our monetary system have obvious religious meanings, and that's not a coincidence. It's because the monetary system came out of the temples. It had a religious authority behind it in the beginning. Gradually it becomes non-religious authorities. So sinful debts are paid by delivering an IOU back to the issuer. We call that redemption. Redemption simultaneously wipes out the sinful debt of both parties. Okay? Both the government is wiped out of debt when you pay your taxes, and you have wiped out your debt. You don't owe taxes anymore, and their debt, currency, has been burned. So you're both out of debt. So we say, hallelujah. It's all debits and credits, keystrokes that record the bonds of indebtedness. You're in debt until redemption day, when the IOUs find their way back. So, those who think a sovereign has to first get tax revenue before spending, the taxes are to produce the revenue the governments can spend. Those who believe a central bank has to first obtain reserves before lending. Those who think private banks have to obtain deposits before they can lend them have all confused two completely different things, redemption and creation. Creation has to come first before redemption. You have to create the debts before you can redeem. Does the government need to receive tax revenue before it spends? Does the central bank need to receive reserve deposits before they can lend? Do private banks need to receive demand deposits before they can lend? No. It obviously has to work in the reverse way. The spending has to come before tax can be paid. The lending has to come before we have deposits. So the logic runs from creation to redemption. How the government spends. Keystrokes, as Bernanke said. spending leads to credits. In the modern monetary system, treasuries no longer cut tally sticks. They no longer stamp coins or print notes that they then spend. That's not the way that works anymore. Treasuries always work through their central banks. So when the Treasury spends now, it is actually the central bank that credits a private bank's reserves. That private bank then credits the deposits of the recipient. So the Treasury is 2 steps removed from the recipient of the Treasury spending. In the old days, it was direct. Treasury spent, bought your wagon, you got the tally stick, or you got the coin, or you got the paper money. Now there's a central bank and a private bank between you and the Treasury. So it's not obvious anymore. Okay? But the principles are still the same. It leads to a credit to your bank account. Taxes are just a reverse. You don't push a wheelbarrow up to the Treasury and pay your taxes with coins anymore. In the old days you did. Today, you either make an electronic payment or you write a check to the Treasury. Your bank account is debited by your bank. The central bank debits your bank's reserves and credits the Treasury's deposit at the central bank. So again, 2 steps removed in tax payments. If the government spends more than it taxes, we call that a deficit. By definition, it means there have been more credits than debits. So bank reserves have been increased, and the recipient's bank accounts have been increased whenever there's deficit spending. Okay? Because we are debiting fewer accounts than we are crediting. Policy implications. You can't run out of keystrokes. Government cannot run out of currency. As long as you have at least one person in the Treasury with one finger, they can still keystroke bank accounts. Okay, you can't run out. Government can always afford to buy anything for sale in its own currency. So if there's something for sale in your own currency, you can always buy it. Now, we can't guarantee that you can buy things that aren't for sale in your currency. Maybe there's some things that are only for sale for, let's say, US dollars. If you don't issue the dollar, you might not be able to buy it. Now, I don't think practically this is ever a problem for any major country because there are plenty of people willing to do the exchange for you, right? So if you needed to get hold of dollars, you can exchange your currency and get the dollars. So practically speaking, it doesn't really matter. If there's unemployed labor, government can always hire it. Existence of unemployment is always a policy error. Governments can always have full employment. The only economic constraints government faces are full employment of resources and inflation. And of course, those 2 things can be linked. Once you get close to full employment, spending more probably is going to lead to inflation. Other constraints are political. So when we had, after the global financial crisis, Obama had a very small stimulus package. It lasted 2 years. And he knew it wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. But Obama would go on TV and say, we'd love to do more, but we run out of money. This can't possibly be true. Either he is ignorant or he is lying. Any head of a sovereign currency issuing country cannot run out of money. They can always spend more. The kinds of claims are made in the US, unsustainable, and made everywhere else too. Unsustainable debt pact. In our particular case, the Chinese might stop lending to us. Of course, that's complete nonsense. Every dollar that the Chinese got came from us. Okay? They're just returning dollars to us to buy government bonds so they can earn more interest. And then other people were pointing to Euroland, but remember, Euroland is the exception. This is a group of countries that all decided to give up their sovereign currency. So they did lose the power individually to spend as much as necessary. There's a very, I'm getting close to the end. There's a very interesting video, you could Google and find it, where Mark Blaug is interviewing Paul Samuelson. It's in the early 70s, I don't remember the year. So this is all Samuelson, and I won't read the whole quote, but superstition, budget has to be balanced. It's an old-fashioned religion created to scare people. Okay? Why? Because we want to get them to behave. So it's just like, the bedtime stories you make up, have been made up for centuries to scare children. That's what it all is. The necessity of balancing the budget is a myth, a superstition, the equivalent of old-time religion. Here's the St. Louis Fed. If you don't know, this was sort of the home to Milton Friedman. Okay, this is the most monetarist of the Feds. I won't read the whole quote, I'll summarize. The government can't run out of money. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It's never subject to the whims of bond vigilant days. There is always a demand for U.S. Government bonds. There is no problem solving that. Here's the King of France. The first duty of the king is to coin money when it's necessary for the sound economic life of his subjects. Coin more. Okay, if it's necessary for the sound economic life. Sectoral balances. I'll go through this in more detail in one of the other lectures. But the idea is that a government deficit isn't something to be feared. So we've already said government can't run out of money. Okay? But deficit and debt sounds bad, even if the government can't run out. It has to be remembered that for every deficit, there has to be a surplus. Okay. If you have just two sectors, a government and private sector, so just for a minute, we'll assume your economy is completely closed. It has to be true by identity that the government's deficit equals the private sector surplus. So the government's debt is the net financial wealth of the private sector. That's what it is. Who is against private sector wealth? Okay, occasionally I do meet someone who's opposed to it. But generally, people think it's good that the private sector has wealth. Okay, well, how can you be against government debt then? Because without government debt, the net financial wealth of the private sector would be zero. Yes, there would be creditors and debtors within the private sector, but they would net to zero. For a creditor, there's a debtor. Adding a government debt allows the private sector to have net wealth. Without a government debt, there cannot be net private sector wealth in the closed economy. Now, if we open it up, then there's an external sector, the rest of the world. So if you were a country that ran a current account surplus, so you're one of the exporting nations, even if your government doesn't have a deficit, you can have net financial wealth, but it is a claim on the rest of the world. So for the world as a whole, that has to net to zero. For every debtor country, United States, there's a surplus country, China, right? We balance. But obviously, not everybody can be a net creditor. Until we find populations on Mars and Jupiter, there have to be debtor countries on Earth. So still, that all nets to zero. You need government debt to have net financial assets. course, I didn't get time to get one of these for Brazil. This is the United States. These are the three sector balances. The foreign sector, which is green, the government sector, which is red, and the domestic private sector is blue. The first thing you notice is it's a mirror image because it balances. Okay, it has to balance. For every surplus above the line, there has to be a deficit below the line. It balances exactly. You will see that the U.S. government sector, the red, is virtually always below the line. Why is that? It runs a deficit. The U.S. private sector is almost always above the line. That means it's running a surplus. We used to run a positive current account, which means that our capital account was negative. She's back. Now we always run a current account deficit, so our capital account is surplus. The rest of the world has a surplus against us. It balances. Okay. Now, I won't go through this unusual period here, where our private sector ran deficits and our government actually ran a surplus for a little while. Okay. This one crashed into the recession at the end of the 90s, the dot-com bust, and then crashed into the global financial crisis. This chart only goes back to 1952. The last time we had run a government surplus and a private sector deficit was in 1929. We crashed into the Great Depression. Okay? In fact, if you go back through U.S. history, we only had 6 budget surpluses in U.S. history. Every one of those was followed by a depression. The correlation is 100%. Doesn't prove anything. It could be a sheer coincidence. Every time our private sector goes into deficit and our government goes into surplus, we crash. But it could be a coincidence. So anyway, that's to put a different light on government deficits. Deficit spending creates private financial wealth. Central bank operations do not. Okay? What they do is they make the private sector more liquid. They don't increase wealth. You can think of it this way: central banks lend and treasuries spend. Some can't run out of this, I'm not going to use. Conclusion. There are two views on the origins of money. There's a Robinson Crusoe story, leads to the barter, commodity money, multiplier, and all that. And money is a social relation where money comes out of possibly the Varigel tradition. We can't know for certain, but it seems to have social origins, not origins in this individualistic barter economy. And at least, as far back as the historical record goes, it has always evolved with the influence and sovereign power and position of debts. Money is not primarily a medium of exchange. Money is a state monopoly, a unit of account, driven by obligations to pay the state, and banks make payments for the customers in bank IOUs that are denominated in the state's money. And that is where we go back to the post-Keynesian endogenous money story. So that's how we link up the two. The endogenous money part of the system is created by the banks, but always in the state's money account. So in a sense, it is the tax system also standing behind the private money system, because they've got to be denominated in the same money account. So I'll stop, and I don't know how much time we have left. I'm happy to take questions.
So
we can read the questions. And se a audiência eventualmente preferir fazer perguntas em português, a gente pode tentar traduzir, quem quiser fazer também diretamente em inglês. Pode ficar à vontade, podemos coletar aí um conjunto de questões e passar para a resposta do professor. No questions? Microphone?
How do you explain Bitcoins?
Okay, so Bitcoins are not, they're not issued as anybody's IOU. So they don't qualify as a money. They're not denominated in a money account. They're not accepted in payment of an obligation. So by my definitions, they are not money. We'll see if they ever really become important. So far, they're mostly speculative devices. So they're tulables. You can buy them hoping the price will go up. They are used in some transactions because there was a belief of complete secrecy that now is beginning to look like maybe they're not going to be able to retain that. Governments are working very hard to break the code. The Chinese government and the US government. So I suspect that they're not going to be valuable for illegal activities for much longer. The transaction costs are huge, which also violates the orthodox definition. They're sort of like the stone wheels, even worse really, because of all the energy that is required to make a transaction. So there's a cost to make the transaction that you're bearing, but there's also a cost to the environment. Takes as much energy as small nations use to transact Bitcoin. So they don't fit the orthodox definition. I think that they are a huge speculative bubble that will burst.
Professor, parabéns pela sua apresentação. Gostaria de saber o que o professor pensa da política monetária do Trump a partir da sua apresentação. Firstly, congratulations on your presentation. What do you think about the monetary policy of Donald Trump in light of your presentation?
Well, he has said one thing that I agree with, which is that there's no reason for the Fed to be raising interest rates. So I think this is completely true. The justification that the Fed and other central banks are using to raise interest rates is just completely nonsensical. Okay? The part of their argument has been that labor markets are getting too tight. Okay, well, there's really no evidence for that whatsoever. We have probably around 15 million people who want and need jobs. Okay, so there still are lots and lots of unemployed people, or out of the labor force, but who would come back in. There's no evidence of wage pressure, which would be the other way to indicate that the labor markets are getting tight. Wages should be going up, but they're not. So there's no wage pressure. Inflation remains low. I know, there's a bit of up and down, and very recently it ticked up, but we have to wait a while to see if it's going to continue to be higher. So even, these are all conventional arguments against the Fed raising rates. My own view is raising rates don't fight inflation anyway. That's a radical view. Conventional people don't think that way, so it's hard to raise that as an objection. But just by conventional measures, the labor market really is not. Okay? The other argument they've been using for 3 or 4 years is that these very low rates are not normal. Okay, well, they're not normal because since the late 70s, the Fed has been keeping rates very high. Okay, so they established a normal that was established by the Fed itself. And over that whole period where we had normal rates, U.S. economy stagnated. Okay, we had a brief period of President Clinton where we did a bit better, but otherwise the whole period was bad for U.S. economic growth. Very substandard growth. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be a very reasonable argument. The normal they wanted to return to was high interest rates where we had substandard growth. Low interest rates existed all during World War II and all the way to the mid-60s. The Fed had normal rates that were very low. Okay, so it depends on what you want to call normal, is what I'm saying. So you're comparing yourself to the Volcker years. Okay, yeah, these are really low, but the Volcker years were terrible. That was an outlier period. In the early post-war period, where we had our best growth ever, we had very low ones. Okay. The reason they want to go to normal is so that when the next crisis hits, they'll be able to lower rates. Okay, so this is what they're arguing. So, okay, we're going to raise rates to slow down the economy in an economy that's heavily over-indebted. Okay, so we slow down, make it harder to make the payments on your debt, so that a crisis becomes virtually inevitable, so that we can lower rates to do some good, to stimulate the economy that's in a crisis that we're going to cause. What kind of an argument is that? It's crazy. Crazy thinking. There's an argument that it's the low rates that have encouraged people to take on debt. There may be a little bit of truth in that. Okay? But the answer to that is not to raise rates once they're already heavily indebted. The answer to that is to try to clamp down on lending and try to find a way to relieve debts. So I think that the financial markets, just as they did before the global financial crisis, are engaged in a lot of practices that are really dangerous. So before the crisis, a lot of it was in housing. And some of that is starting to come back. But most of it is not in housing. It's in student loans, it's in auto-related debt, automobiles, and in credit cards. So there's lots of debt out there. 1.3 trillion in student loans, 1.3 trillion in car-related debt, and I think about the same in credit card debt. You add those all up, it looks a lot like the mortgage. so there's lots of problems in each one of those kinds of markets. So they should be clamping down on that, but you clamp down on financial institutions to try to prevent them from engaging in those kinds of practices. Even no-doc loans are coming back, just like they had before the crisis. So that's the way to try to reduce the excessive borrowing, clamp down on the financial practices. So none of the arguments hold up. The labor market argument, the normality argument, and the, we want to have room to lower rates, but just keep them low. Other than that, I really don't know what Trump's ideas are. Monetary policy or anything else. I don't know how he came up with that. I'll tell you, before he actually took office, I had some hope that he would do a few things right. And it looks like he really cannot. His personality, but also his team. They just don't have any idea how to get things done. They don't know how to control him, but they also don't know how to deal with Congress. They don't know how to push through things. So I thought we would get infrastructure, because I talked to someone behind him, really pretty amazing. He agreed with the job guarantee. He agreed with the basics of modern money theory. He said, don't worry, I have a lot of influence with Trump. We'll turn out. He was wrong, and he's out, too. He didn't last long. So there just really isn't much.
I think we have at least 2 more questions. Is it okay?
Yes, we need to move.
Rodrigo?
Well, Professor, I'd like to know if it is possible to identify a moment, not in time, but a logical moment in which the tax obligation becomes irrelevant for enforcing the demand for state money. A moment in which the taxation itself becomes not important. The taxation is not the state money. In a way in which the demand for money becomes autonomous in relation to taxation.
Okay, so there are 2 different ways to go about this. If you impose a tax of 100, and you will only accept your own currency, you know you can issue 100. Okay, 100 will be demanded. If you can impose and enforce a tax of 100. Okay, if the penalties are severe, including prison, in the old days, including death, I don't know about death anymore, but including prison, you're going to get 100. You'll be able to spend 100. So can you spend more than that? Right? Well, that will depend. So here, there is no absolute answer I can give you. Okay? Because people know they have this obligation to pay taxes. And they're probably going to accept more than their tax liability. Okay? Why? Well, you know that next year you're going to have to pay it again, and the year after that, and the year after that. And you know others have this obligation too. And they probably will accept the currency from you. Okay? So you can hold some of it, and you, in anticipation of paying future taxes, and in anticipation that other people are going to need it to pay their tax liability. So exactly how much? I can't give you an answer to that. Okay? It also depends on whether we're talking about a thoroughly monetized economy or a primitive economy where a colonizer has come in. So when Europeans colonized Africa or like the Yap Islands, the population had no use for the currency other than paying taxes. So their demand for the German currency is going to be pretty small. They're not monetized economies. They don't need money for everyday life. Right? And that's why the colonizers learned that the kinds of taxes they imposed had to be very specific kinds of taxes. You couldn't use an income tax, right? Because everyone can avoid the tax by not having any income, and they don't need income. Because everything they need for everyday life is produced in tribal society arrangements, so they don't need any monetary income. So they would impose a hut tax. Okay? Well, everyone needs a hut. Or a head tax. Everyone needs a head. So, those would drive it. Income taxes won't. Jump forward to our societies. Very hard to live without any money income. So income taxes work perfectly fine. But that's only because we have thoroughly monetized economies. Once you have a thoroughly monetized economy, you need money for everything you do. So it's just inconceivable that you're going to refuse to accept the government's currency. There's zero chance. Every one of you needs more, right? Because we're thoroughly monetized. So there's no chance they're not going to take the government's currency. Now, can you get inflation? Yeah, you can get inflation. So the problem won't be that you can't get it accepted. The problem will be as you increase your spending, okay, you start trying to bid against other bidders for the resources. So you can start getting inflation. That can happen before full employment, depending on what you're trying to buy. So the problem really isn't getting the currency accepted. How high does inflation have to go before people stop accepting it? Well, really high. Really high. Right? You guys can have 40% inflation, and you're still perfectly happy. Well, not perfectly happy. I was kidding. But when it gets to 10,000% a week, yeah, maybe you won't take